She was 19 years old, standing in the wings of the CBS theater, and she could hear them arguing about her. The voices weren't loud, but they carried. Producers, executives, men in suits who controlled what America was allowed to see. They were talking about her skin, about sponsors, about southern stations threatening to cut the broadcast, about money. She stood there in her costume, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and she waited to find out if she would be erased. It was 1955. The Ed Sullivan Show was live in 30 minutes. And Ed Sullivan, the man who could make or break careers with a single introduction, was being told to make a choice. What he decided in the next few moments would define more than just one evening. It would define what kind of man he was. The silence in that hallway was suffocating. She could hear the studio audience filing in. She could hear the orchestra warming up. She could hear everything except the one thing she needed to hear, that she would be allowed to perform. Her name was Janet Collins, though history would nearly forget it. She was one of the most gifted dancers of her generation, trained in classical ballet, a performer who had already broken barriers at the Metropolitan Opera. But on this night, in this building, none of that mattered. What mattered was that she was black, and in 1955, that was enough to make her invisible. Ed Sullivan stood in the corridor outside his dressing room, listening to the men in suits explain the situation. They were calm, professional. They laid it out like a math problem. The Southern affiliates had made it clear. If a black performer appeared on the show, they would cut away, replace the broadcast with local programming. The sponsors were nervous. Advertisers were threatening to pull out. This wasn't personal, they said. This was business. And Ed Sullivan, who had spent years building this show into the most watched program in America, was being asked to protect it. All he had to do was tell the girl she couldn't go on, apologize, explain that the timing wasn't right, make it easy, make it go away. But Ed Sullivan wasn't built that way. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who he was. He wasn't a performer. He was stiff on camera, awkward, almost uncomfortable in his own skin. People made jokes about his delivery, his posture, the way he introduced acts like he was reading from a phone book. But what Ed Sullivan had was something deeper than charisma. He had conviction. He'd grown up Irish Catholic in New York, the son of a customs agent, and he'd spent his early years as a sports writer, covering boxers and baseball players, men who fought for respect in a world that didn't give it easily. He knew what it looked like when the system tried to crush someone, and he'd spent the last 8 years of his career using his show not just to entertain but to integrate. Slowly, carefully, dangerously, he'd put black performers on his stage before: Nat King Cole, Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, and every time he'd faced pressure, angry letters, threats, stations in the South cutting away or refusing to air the episodes. But Ed kept doing it, not because it was easy, because he believed the stage he controlled should reflect the country he lived in, not the one people wanted to pretend existed. And now, standing in that hallway with Janet Collins waiting in the wings and 30 million people about to tune in, he was being told to stop, to draw a line, to choose safety over principle. Ed Sullivan looked at the men in suits. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just said, "She goes on." They tried again, explained the financial risk, the backlash, the danger to the show's future. He repeated himself, "She goes on." One of the executives pressed harder, his tone sharper now. What about the sponsors? What about the affiliates? What about everything they'd built? Ed Sullivan's face didn't change. He looked at the man and said something that would be remembered by everyone in that hallway for the rest of their lives. "Then let them cut away. She performs. The room went silent. There was nothing left to say. Ed Sullivan had made his decision, and it was final. He turned and walked toward Janet Collins, who was still standing in the wings, her eyes red, her breathing shallow. She'd heard enough to know what was happening. Ed stopped in front of her, and for a moment he just looked at her, not with pity, not with hesitation, with respect. He told her she was going on, that nothing had changed, that she should dance the way she'd rehearsed, and that he'd be watching from the side of the stage. She nodded, unable to speak, and he walked away to prepare his introduction. When the show went live, Ed Sullivan walked out onto that stage the same way he always did. Stiff, formal, a little uncomfortable. The audience applauded. The cameras rolled, and then he introduced Janet Collins. His voice was steady. He didn't acknowledge the controversy. He didn't explain or justify. He simply said her name, described her as one of the finest dancers in America, and stepped aside. The spotlight found her, and she began to move. What happened next was extraordinary, not because of spectacle, not because of drama, but because of grace. Janet Collins danced with a power and elegance that transcended the hatred surrounding her. Every movement was deliberate. Every gesture carried weight. She wasn't just performing, she was claiming space. She was refusing to be erased. The studio audience, many of whom had likely never seen a black ballerina before, watched in silence. Some were moved, some were uncomfortable, but everyone was watching. And in homes across America, 30 million people saw her too. In the South, some stations did exactly what they'd threatened. They cut away, replaced her with static or local programming, but others didn't. And for the first time, in living rooms where it had never been allowed before, a young black girl could turn on the television and see someone who looked like her dancing on the most important stage in the country. When Janet finished, the applause was immediate and overwhelming. Ed Sullivan walked back onto the stage. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He shook her hand, thanked her, and moved on to the next act. To anyone watching, it might have seemed routine, just another performance on just another Sunday night. But everyone in that building knew what had just happened. A line had been crossed. A decision had been made, and there was no going back. The fallout came quickly. Letters poured into CBS. Some praised Ed Sullivan for his courage. Others called him a traitor, a communist, a disgrace. Sponsors complained. Affiliates threatened to drop the show. The pressure was immense. But Ed Sullivan didn't apologize. He didn't back down. He kept booking black performers, kept putting them on his stage, kept refusing to let fear dictate what America was allowed to see. And slowly, painfully, the culture began to shift. Not because of one performance, but because someone with power decided to use it for something other than self-preservation. Janet Collins never became a household name. Her career continued. But history has a way of forgetting the people who break barriers. What matters is that she was there, that she danced, that she refused to disappear, and that Ed Sullivan, a man who could have chosen the easy path, chose the right one instead. Years later, when asked about that night, Janet said it wasn't the performance she remembered most. It was the moment Ed Sullivan looked at her in the wings and told her she was going on. That simple act of belief, she said, changed everything. Ed Sullivan hosted his show for 23 years. He introduced the Beatles to America. He gave Elvis Presley a platform. He launched careers and shaped the culture of an entire generation. But the moments that defined him weren't always the biggest ones. They were the moments when he stood in a hallway and refused to let fear win, when he put someone on stage, knowing it would cost him, when he chose integrity over applause. Those were the moments that revealed who he really was. That night in 1955, with a young black dancer waiting in the wings and the weight of an entire system pressing down on him, Ed Sullivan made a choice. He chose her. He chose principle. He chose to believe that his stage belonged to everyone, not just the people who were easy to show. And in doing that, he proved that real courage isn't loud. It's quiet. It's steady. It's saying she goes on when every powerful person in the room is telling you to stop. The cameras kept rolling. The show went on. But for those who understood what was happening, it wasn't just entertainment. It was defiance. It was progress. It was a reminder that change doesn't always come from protests or legislation. Sometimes it comes from one person with a platform deciding that some things are more important than comfort, more important than money, more important than safety. What would you have done in that hallway? If this story moved you, consider subscribing. These moments deserve to be remembered.